or argument. So again, if you look at it, it's just a list with first thing as function and the remaining things as arguments. So it's the same thing. Here the function is defin, which the purpose of that is to define a function, right? So this is a syntax basically to define a function, and this function does nothing. It goes into the DOM, and this is JavaScript interop. It's like it's like saying document.getElement by ID, and you give it the ID. But I simplified it because I didn't want to type that again and again by saying by ID. So this is a very simple RUM widget. Basically, it's saying RUM def C. Def C stands for def component. Give it a name, and it takes 2 parameters. And now if you've done React, you know props and you know states and things like that. So you can think of these as kind of like props, but they're not really. I mean, they're slightly different. But you're passing it, and then in this you're creating this vector, and this vector is something kind of like hiccup kind of. I don't know. It's basically defining a div element with alert class on it and alert success, and has something inside of it, and that something is repeat the text n times. So if I pass it 5, which goes here, and pass it what, which goes here, it basically concatenates what 5 times, and this is what it looks like, right? I mount it by saying, hey RUM, this is my ID, get the app1 div and run this app1 on it. This is the basic thing you need to know. The thing I was talking about fig wheel is if I make live changes, it changes right away without me doing anything. So I can experiment, you know, I can change it to danger, and it'll quickly, you know, do all the things for me. So this is a very live interactive environment for me to play with. Huh?
I hate you.
So this is the first very basic app. You can play around with it as much as you want, and it'll keep doing things that you want to do. You want to repeat it more times, so you say repeat and 2 times n. So instead of 5 times, it'll be 10 times and things like that, right? So it's doing all that.
So is that going through React?
Yeah. So this is kind of like defining a React class, probably by a name called app1. There's special syntax to kind of export it to JavaScript land, but most people don't care about it, so it's not very, you know. And this is, it generates a React class. This is like react.dom.mount or whatever, render or whatever function that is. This is what it's encapsulating.
So do you have any amount of JavaScript that you write?
No. No, I mean, the only JavaScript I've written so far is sort of this, and this is mostly like interop with, right?
So there's like a RUM mount, like your script tag in this HTML.
Yeah.
It's mounting RUM something.
No, I mean, my script tag is just my JavaScript that's emitted by my compiler. Okay. It takes care of, so it looks at the namespace, it imports it, and then runs, for release builds, it runs dead code elimination on it using the Google Clojure compiler or whatever. And, you know, it's basically I just include, and these are the divs that I have. The app1 that I have here is, you know, that one. So, you know, very simple, very bare bone, doesn't do anything, doesn't, you know, there's nothing groundbreaking here. Now, the thing I was talking about, RUM is so simple that it wouldn't even like re-render stuff for you. Like if something changes, some state changes, like screw you, you do it. You do it yourself. So this is like a manual, you know, RUM rendering, and I'll change it to automatic, and I'll show you like how it's better and, you know, things like that. Here, my component is nothing. It's like a button. Again, it's a div. It's a button element with a button class with a button primary style on it. And this is like how I pass attributes. It's kind of like a map of all the JavaScript things, like what to do on click, and if I want to pass styles to it, or I want to pass, like, you know, the attributes of a DOM element. Button also takes the name, you know, or a string, what to render on it, and then finally there's this is basically Bootstrap. It's like if you want a badge, you do this, and it's a span with a badge. Now here's something interesting that you know, the what is this called? The @ and a state do. Clojure had this fancy thing called atom, which is you can put anything inside an atom, kind of like very crude variable. You put anything inside atom, and later you can change it. It's like state2 is an atom, and I want to change what it's holding. So I want to put 1 inside of it. And it says, fine, I'll do it. I'll put 1 inside of it. It's kind of like an atomic operation. It blocks all threads and things like that. And then when you want to read it, you put this add sign in front of it. Like, give me the value what's inside the atom. If I just say state2, it's or this, it's just the atom. It's not the value inside of it. When I do this, it's the value inside of it, and it's more complicated than that. Think of it as a very crude JavaScript variable where you can change values, but still things are. It's kind of like more like a pointer to a constant thing than the thing itself. So another thing Atom lets you do, and it's really powerful, and I use it all the time, is whenever it changes, it'll let you know that, hey, somebody changed it. And that's what the add watch does. So its add watch is kind of like, hey, add a watch to state2 and give it an ID. This could be whatever I wanted. This could be hello. It's just like an ID. Later when I want to remove this watch, I use this. And then every time it changes, it calls this function. And this function has 4 parameters. It kind of tells you what was the old state of the atom, what's the new state of the atom, and you can diff them and figure out what the changes were, right? And what I'm basically doing there is just re-render it. So request render for the given component. And the C I got was from the mount called here. So every time I click, it goes to state and changes it. Now swap basically is kind of like an atomic operation. It's like, okay, you have a value inside of you and I want to change it. And it's like, okay, you want to change it. How do you want to change it? And how do I want to change is the question I answer with a function. It's like, here's the function, pass it the old value, and this function will return the new value. And whatever, so that's kind of like what guarantees the atomicity. It's like, here's the changing function or the mutator. You give it the old value and it will return the new value. So my function in this case is basically inc, which means incremented. So every time I click, swap the state value by incrementing it. So if I go there and click it, it increments it, right?
What does the hash signify?
This is a function. Sorry, I could have done this. That's the same thing. Mm-hmm. It's like a short form.
Okay.
So I can do that. And I'm doing a lot of manual stuff here. I'm adding a watch myself, and I can put here things like, I can put O for O and guys, let me know if I'm going to verbals, okay? Because I can talk about Clojure more. Okay. So there's O and then there's N, right? And if I look at my console, every time if I hit a button here, it should print the old and new value, right? Nice. So every time it's doing it, it's notifying me. Now, this is manual work. We don't want to do this, man. Like every time I want to manage state, I don't want to do this shit. So now RUM has a concept which is very dear to me from JavaScript land. There's very few things and this was like, I think the first time I learned about it was from Ruby and the concept of mixins. That's the first time I ever saw it. I was like, what the hell is mixin? That's the first time I had to look it up because I encountered it in Ruby. So what RUM has is like to latch on behavior to your component, you add mixins. Like, oh, you want it to have local state, like generally not considered good, but if you want it, here's the mixin that'll do it for you. Or do you want it to be, reactive, like like Knockout or what are the other reactive frameworks like FRP? If you want, all of that functionality, like React is capable of it. You have to just write code, and it kind of like does that for you. So this is the same exact example as app 2, but here there's this funny thing here. One is this bracket, and the other one is this. Another good thing about Lisps in general is you can invent syntax. You want some fancy syntax, you can invent it. It lets you do that. Like, I want this new funky. I don't know if you can get rid of braces, or parentheses, but like this is no special. This doesn't have any special meaning. It's just the author of this library decided that I want it to look like that, and then he made it like that. Like there's no like a certain paradigm.
Is it a macro or what's?
Yeah. So defcs is a macro. It's kind of like macro is kind of like while you're compiling Lisp, you can generate Lisp. Yeah, don't ask me who thought of it, but that guy's, you know. So it's the same thing, but instead now it has like a local state, and that local state is available as rum/local, which is kind of like a getter. It's kind of like in JavaScript, the equivalent of that would be state rum local, kind of like that, like this statement. But it's way more powerful. It's like, you know, it does other things. So this is, I'm getting that local out, and let is kind of like, give me a thing out, and then I want to bind it. Again, I have the button, I do the same swap, but instead of rendering state, I'm rendering local now, and it's exactly the same thing. And it does the same thing. But this time, I didn't have to manually do anything. The other thing is, you know, being reactive, you know, that's the fourth, is like, hey, when a change happens to you, I'll automatically re-render something, or you know, I have a state here, for example. At first I define button styles, which is kind of like a vector, an array of different Bootstrap button styles. It's called button styles. Then I have a def ones, basically, don't worry about it, similar, as same as def. And it has a value inside of it called default. Here is my mix-in syntax. You know, something called reactive, and I'll tell you what that is. And then in my button, it's the same thing. It's just that I'm creating the class slightly differently now. I'm passing it as a string, button, and you know, whatever is in state 4, push it out, and you know, concat this string together. And then on my click, you basically, reset is another one. Like swap is one that I'll give you the old, give me the new. Reset is I don't care about the old, just set the new value in. And what reset is doing is picking a random element out of the button style. And what it does is, when I do the reset of state 4, it detects that I had asked for my code to react to it, like this react call. And it'll automatically, like, kind of like re-render the whole thing, because there's a reaction to it somewhere. You know, state 4 has a reaction attached to it. Now if this is the button, so if I click on it, it changes the, you know. And why is it changing? Because of this reaction stuff. And this is again available as a mix-in. It's like some little bit of code doing something for you before and after this call, and it, you know, implements this behavior.
So that registers some like watch from then on?
Yeah.
Or
yeah.
How does the watch implement it? Like,
the same way, add watch. The first thing I showed.
But does that mean that when you set it, it's through a function that triggers something? Or like Angular's dirty watching? Well,
what's happening here is when my render is being called, so there's a way for a mix-in to intercept the render. So when the render is called, it intercepts that call, and before and after that code, it's doing something to capture this RUM react. And that's done through bindings, which is a Clojure concept of, like, you know, scoping a variable to a certain part of the code. So every time you say RUM react, it's basically saying, oh, you know, state 4 is an atom, and return the value of the atom, and also add a watch.
So if you change state 4 outside of this,
yeah,
would it still notice?
Yeah. So if I have state 4 here, and this REPL, this is kind of like a REPL-driven development. It's connected to my browser right now. So if I, you know, say reset state 4 success, it changes. Right. So it's so that's.
Does it hook like? Does it use JavaScript like setter?
I don't know what it uses behind the scenes. I mean, so there's an Atom implementation. I don't know what they do behind the scenes.
Okay.
But Atom is the one that's observable and kind of like.
Well, but it's using React behind the scenes, right? So like.
To render the view.
Yeah.
Right. So the identity of the state, the props or whatever it is like changing when you do that swap or reset. So that's how, like, React is using it.
But it's not using React set state. It doesn't look like.
Well, it's doing it internally, but not here. No. Here is just an atom which is scoped around, you know, which is here, and it's basically, I have defined it myself and it's basically saying anytime this changes, re-render the whole thing. That's all RUM React is kind of like encapsulating from you. So yeah.
And so there's tons of side effects. Like RUM React has this big old side effect of adding a watcher.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
I'm only just getting into the functional stuff. And
Yeah. I mean, that's what I'm saying. It's not as pure as. Yeah, I guess. So there's another thing, a binding, which is kind of like slightly advanced, which is kind of capturing side effects inside a shell sort of a deal. But that's yeah.
It's so hard to understand.
but it's the same thing. The other thing is, a more advanced thing is like, this is like, I promise there are only 7 of these. They don't go to like 25. So this is like a slightly more advanced, and what it does is, let me remind. Yeah. So this is using something called a static mixing. So one good thing about Clojure, like I said, was like diffing two things. Like, hey, did this thing change? And if you want that behavior and you want to optimize your rendering based on that, you use this. So basically, I render a component and I give it a property 5. Let's say, hey, render 5. And if I send a 5 again, this thing will re-render. It will basically just blindly re-render it. Okay, here you go, 5 again. But I don't want to do that. I mean, if the value didn't change, I don't want to re-render it. So avoid rendering it. So the behavior is that the top one is showing the numbers as they're incrementing, and the bottom one is just showing the device. No, what is the number? The quotient of the division. So here, I mean, it'll make more sense when I do this. So as I increment, the color, the background color of the cell changes every time I render. It's just a random color. So every time I'm rendering, the top one is rendering, right? And it's rendering and it's changing the color. But the bottom one, although it's being called, and I'll show you the code that, hey, render it, it doesn't change the color. The rendering is not called yet. So that's kind of like an optimization. Hey, don't change it if any of the inputs didn't change. And this is the code for it. It's basically, this is the whole local stuff from before. But I have 2 wells, and wells is nothing. It's a bootstrap well, which has some padding, some margin, and a background color, which is random, basically an HSL color I just created. And a span inside of it, and just renders the number. I have 2 wells. One is just rendering the local value, which is incrementing every time, and the second one is, the quotient, like the shit, that's not this term, whatever it is, that part of it. So it's being called every frame. This is being rendered every frame, but this call is kind of like a no-op every time. The quotient of any number divided by 5 is the same. So I'm still doing the on-click, incrementing it, and this second function call basically has no effect on the UI.
It's not static that's doing that?
Yes, the static mixing does that. So static mixing is slightly smarter and says, oh, do I need to, so React has this function called should update, right? It's like called it on a component, hey, should I update this component? So it intercepts that and compares the values and says, no, you shouldn't update it, and then it closes the render.
It just stores the last value you passed to it and does like a comparison?
Yeah. Well, I think React has it for, I don't know, if not. Well, it's pretty simple, you can look at the code. And then there's a concept of cursors also. Although I'm not, because I've written a whole full-fledged app using cursors, I'm not a big fan of this. But basically the thing is, there's a top-level object, and you can, let's say there's a map. There's like username, like I have here. It's like a profile, and in profile there's a property username, and this is actually a map. It's like a hash map, or like an object in JavaScript, right? This is a profile which has another map inside of it, which is a username, and then the final name of the person. So cursor is basically like giving little components, little parts of it. Like, I just want one component to only know about this part, and not about the rest of the stuff. So you can like make the cursor on a smaller scope inside the object and pass it to a component. But the good thing that comes with it is that you can still modify it. You can still propagate the change all the way to the top, and that's what I don't like about it. So without going into too much of, is a profile component, which is basically rendering, a username element, and username is just taking the username and putting it inside with a nice icon, is putting the name here, and then a button. And this change my name button is basically resetting that username, which is like a very little scope of the whole map. And here, this profile thing is picking out a cursor from the cursor that was passed to it, and which part of the cursor you want to pick is what it's saying. And then finally, here's where you're passing the whole thing down. So if I click this button, and if I look at the state of this, right now the username is John McCarthy, and the button only knows about this area. It doesn't know about where it came from. It doesn't know about what profile is and what is. So every time I change the name, for example, now it's Rich Hickey, and I look at it, it is able to go into that, walk into that tree and change it. I mean, this is like an observable cursor thing. I don't really like them very much, but I thought I'll mention it. And the last thing is, writing your own mixin. I don't know. Did mount will unmount a standard React thing. So what I'm doing here is, in did mount, I'm setting up an interval to request a render every second, and in unmount, I'm kind of like clearing it. Transfer state, it's RUM's own functional thing. It's, I don't completely understand it, but I think I get some of it and I understand.
But basically, the mixins are just maps of functions that map sort of to the React. To the React lifecycle hooks.
Yeah. Like basically, you can have like 10 mixins, and all of those functions will be collected, and in the order in which you specify, like my mixin, one of the mixins here I have two mixins. You can have any number actually. I have cursored and cursored watched. It's not important what the difference is at this point, but so you can have any number, and all of them can have render functions. So the first one will be called, and the second one will be called with the output of the first one, and the third will be called with the output of the second one. And you can keep making things and keep latching on things. So here, my mixin is basically refreshing this widget every second. You can see the time changes here and the color changes. So this is my own custom mixin. So this is, I think, 144 lines of code. This is really compact. I like it.
Can you say, you introduced this by saying you were in love with but then after 2 years it became sort of unmanageable.
Yeah.
And this helped you manage it just by like wrapping the React bindings in?
No, it helps me manage it because I make my own decisions. I mean,
so what was hard and now it'll be easy?
So let's say a case of Ohm. And Ohm, the guys are like really after the designing library. Their goals are slightly different than mine. They are, okay, each component in Ohm needs to be completely independent, needs to be completely reusable. Each component in Ohm needs to advertise what data it needs, which maps into like the GraphQL and then maps into like fetching the data from the server. Man, at my point, that's way too much technology baggage already. Like, that's not how my stuff works, and that's and that's one of the decisions. I'm not saying I like that decision. That's a really good decision. But there are some other decisions, like how do they represent these properties? How are they pulled? There's like you look at it, it's not simple anymore. It's not, and people agree that it's not simple. And that's the whole purpose of doing Clojure, because you have to make things simple. Because the domain is complex. It's like really hard problems people have to solve, but that's just one more solution that I have to learn about, and I have to understand that solution first before I can start doing my job. So let me make my decisions, and let me use my experience, and how you design your app, how you led to designing that is based on your experiences, and
Is it framework versus library, basically.
Yeah,
Would it
yeah.
be fair to say that RUM has become a framework?
Yeah,
Or
yeah.
was it a framework in the beginning?
It was kind of like a React wrapper, but now they're trying to solve the whole problem, start to finish. And motivation is great. I mean, people say if you were doing a really big project, it's really worth it. And I believe those guys because, you know, that's how I got into Clojure. But I don't know, man. I don't understand it. It's like so much I need to know before I can make a decision. It's kind of like you're in the cloud and you're like, do I know all the directions before I take a step? Kind of a deal.
Well, sounds like when I first saw Node for the first time, I'm like, what? No, you don't run JavaScript on the server. Like, none of this is possible. What are you talking about?
Yeah, no.
That doesn't work.
So have you used this in real app yet?
No. I'm just trying to learn and see. Maybe next week I'll come back and say it was shit because. But I made like really nice demos.
You gotta monetize this thing.
What?
Changing colors as a service.
HTTP call and you get a random color. Man, random colors are so fucking.
And then pull it
Yeah.
from NPM.
Totally bundle that up, put it on NPM. And I can
Isn't that
do
like true as a service? Isn't that a service? Isn't that right? Recently that came, right? You make a request?
Yeah, Truthy has this.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
As long as you can put in a container.
Yeah. But this is kind of like something that I would consider for a toy project because it gets you up and running really fast. If I'm writing a really big software, I will consider it for a little more.
Yeah, I think you'd have to. You probably have to like build some macros that package up some like commonly used combinations of mixins,
Yeah,
right, and stuff like that.
yeah.
Just add some static text.
But then